since 20 years. So, I'm in the government side, and have been working in South Africa for right now, and have recently used projects in the CNI space with NLP as well, and sustainability as a private of tech. And coming to the topic here, so from an aggregator's perspective, it's to us it's nothing more like a virtual power plant which has more flexibility to offer to its customers as compared to an IPP which is dedicatedly signing a PPA with a single off-taker. And many a times when we are advising our clients, we have seen that many a times there is a mismatch between the demand of the mining company and what the project can produce and what's the appropriate size of that project is. And that's where it becomes complex for an IPP to engage with two off-takers, and that's where it gets messy, and you tend to spend a lot of time doing the development of the project and to spend a lot of development cost, which essentially makes the project unviable many a times. And that's where the aggregators comes into picture, where they have a quite a standardized process in terms of PPA with the suppliers, with their own gencos, or with the buyers that they are buying, and essentially solving for the PPA tenor mismatch and the capacity demand mismatch that any company or any mining company would have within IPP. So from that perspective, I think we'll discuss more on the topic in terms of how this can further escalate the decarbonization for the mining as a sector, and rather not just looking at the individual mines. Thank you.
Thanks, Amit. I can add what John.
Apart from the model that we're seeing in mainly in the Southern Africa, there have been initiative being taken to cover similar kind of model for the other part of Africa as well, which is by Africa Green Co. And they are active in Zambia and then trying to foray into the Southern Africa, not just South Africa, but also trying to cover other countries as well. And that's where it can offer alternative to single buyer and single user model, where they act as a alternative to the utilities, which is quite difficult in Africa to close a project because of different reasons altogether that we all know. But apart from the Africa part, if we look at developed markets, be it Europe or others, so aggregator model, it just doesn't stop at buying power and solving for the PPA tenor mismatch and the capacity mismatch, but it goes beyond that, whereby the aggregators are not just solving for these two aspects, but they are also trying for the peak demand. They are also trying to solve for the grid stabilization, and that is something when we talk about today in South Africa or in other Southern Africa, we only talk about the energy part, and in future maybe we see that the batteries are also on one side of the on the aggregators, where they would probably end up supporting and providing balancing grid services to the grid as well. And at the same time, as we see in other developed markets, where aggregators tend to match the peak demand as well, and good amount of batteries either behind the meter or on the meter on the grid are being used so as to get to this problem, whereby because if you run to match any peak demand, you essentially need to run on the peakers, which are obviously very costly, and you tend to only go with the fossil fuel solutions. And with batteries, you can actually manage that well, and you can shift the peaks and you can manage the peaks well, which essentially helps to build this model more stronger and to cater to the overall requirements for the power solution. But this is something may not be applicable in the part of the world that you're talking about, but this is something regulations has to work around so that this can be feasible, and the whole space needs to be worked around so that this facilitates the transition that we're talking about to the developed markets.
Yeah, thanks. So you all know about the power poles that we have in the continent.
has its own pros and cons. If I talk about the IPP, they can probably secure the guarantee structure better. They can probably secure the other conditions in the PPA better, but that may not be something that a customer is looking at from the IPPs, and that's where the whole mismatch in terms of expectation is, and the development period is quite long when we are going with that typical process. But when the aggregator comes in between, the processes are very standardized. There are many risk allocation that you don't even need to think about. As Duncan was mentioning, given you have a diversification on the supply and demand, you can easily allocate your resources to better optimize the overall system. Whereas in case of single IPP, it's not the case. Uh, they only have one customer. They probably have an alternative to look into the spot markets, day-ahead markets, and even to maybe sell to the aggregators as well. But at the same time, that doesn't offer them that flexibility, and you need to look at banking power solutions and other solutions which are complex for a mining company to understand, because that's not their core business that they are into, and they don't want to put a lot of resources to just develop this part, whereas they can do it easily with an aggregator solution, where they know that they have a lot of flexibility. They don't need to provide as much securities as an IPP would ask for.
Uh,
Sorry, can I just add something? And just looking at it in the South African context, it's actually a very interesting question.
First is whether how we can prove this model is really a sustainable model in Southern Africa, where we are talking about this a lot. So that's first thing. And given this is recently being adopted, and there's a lot of buzz around this, the first question I think that everyone needs to answer, or everyone needs to figure out, is the sustainability of this model. Whether 5 year down the line, should we still see the same momentum in the market on this model, and how do we make sure that 5 years down the line, no one is looking back and saying, oh, we did something which we should not have done, mainly because you're just relying on an aggregator from a lender's and from an equity perspective, which may not be that well capitalized as probably a mining company or any other offtaker would be. And that's where there should be a KPIs that needs to be well imposed on the aggregators, and well administrator in terms of the sector diversification, it as to what kind of offtakers they are signing the supply agreements with, and what kind of the PPA tenors that they have, and all those things that needs to be administered. So once that is there, and definitely this can be replicated, but the question again comes back to the regulation and the willingness of the authorities to implement and to facilitate this kind of solution in the market. And if we talk about the solution, one of the major enabler for this solution is an open access to the grid, which not many countries on the continent have that kind of regulation. So we only talk about very little countries which allow you to have open access to the grid, and allow you to wheel power. And that's how this overall solution is working on, and we are not doing behind the grid things, and just doing everything on the grid. So that's the first enabler that we need to have in the markets to replicate the solution, and to build the sustainability around the solution.
Thanks. I think that's quite an important point. Is will the African countries or the utilities in the continent open up their grid to allow this wheeling? That's quite an important point. And how I see it, is many of the mining companies will
By charging slightly better tariff to the industrial customers, and that just can disrupt the overall model for the utility, and they probably need to rethink around as to how they can make their tariffs cost reflective, and that's the major issue on the continent, and that's the major issue that utilities have not been able to do their job properly. That major reason is the cost effective tariffs and are not present on the continent.
Maybe just to add to that, I think the other thing that we mustn't forget as well is the decarbonization element. Because
to escalate the decarbonization for the overall industry, given how the standard the processes is in terms of getting into a PPA with the aggregator or signing supply agreement with the mining company, and how Ivan mentioned that how you can replicate it once it's done with one developer, you can easily replicate it and do it in no time, and that essentially helps you to minimize the development period. And that's where the bottleneck is, because construction time would probably remain the same as it is in both the scenarios. And once you are into operations, then you are just putting green electrons to the grid. So what we need to focus on and to basically accelerate this process is to minimize the development time, and that's essentially the solution is helping, and in future how to replicate this for the continent.
Well,
Well, thanks, Amit.